Yeah, let us get started. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Let us have the sincere intentions, lillahi ta'ala. So last week, we went back to finishing the chapter of prayer, specifically the integrals of prayer. So we talked about so far to stand if able and have the intention of the prayer in one's heart, to say Allahu Akbar, to stand for the obligatory prayer if able. So continuing from there, the author said, to recite the Fatiha, including the Bismillah, and doubling the letters that must be doubled, in order and succession without lengthy interruption, articulating its letters properly. The explanation. Among the integrals of the prayer is to recite the Fatiha. It's an obligation for one to recite the Fatiha whether one is an imam, led by another person, or praying alone. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, which means the one who does not recite the Fatiha in his prayer is invalid. This hadith was narrated by Bukhari. This is why the one who is praying has to recite the Fatiha, whether as an imam, a follower, or praying alone. And this is why Imam Shafi'i said so. As for the other three imams, Ahmad, Abu Hanifa, and Maliki, they said the recitation of the imam stands. It's enough for the validity of the prayer of the follower. So Al-Fatiha contains 7 verses, and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is among the verses. The one who does not recite it, his recitation is invalid. Also, there are letters that are doubled in the surah. There are 14 positions in the Fatiha that are doubled, stressed, and the one needs to observe that when reciting this surah. If one leaves out doubling one of those positions, his reciting is invalid, except if he repeats that word or letter properly. Now, if he doubles a position which is not originally doubled, his recitation is still valid. An example, how one recitation would be invalid if he does not double the letter properly for iyaka. If one recites it as iyaka instead of iyaka, in this case, his recitation is invalid. Moreover, in this position, leaving out doubling, the letter changes the meaning. So iyaka or iya in Arabic language means sunlight. So iyaka na'bud means we worship your sunlight, which is kufr. So if someone knows the meaning and he says it voluntarily, one blasphemes by that. Also, it's an obligation when reciting the Fatiha to recite with the same succession, without lengthy separation between one verse and another. So if one separates one verse and another with long separation, the recitation is invalid. So when the people, they talk, usually, and they talk, and then they stop talking, and between one statement or another. So the person who talks, he stops for a short period of time in a way that if one is listening, they would know that he's going to continue talking. So if one stops for that period of time when reciting the Fatiha, this does not affect the succession of the verse, and it's still valid. If one stops for more than that, this affects the succession of the verse. So it means that stopping to take a breath does not invalidate the recitation. Now, if someone stops for more than that period because of an excuse, like he was coughing, in this case, this does not interrupt his recitation and is still valid. If one interrupts the recitation of Fatiha by making dhikr, this invalidates his recitation and he has to repeat the surah. So, for example, if someone in the middle of the surah says Subhanallah, in this case, the recitation is interrupted and he needs to go back to the beginning and repeat the surah. This is if it is not required to say this dhikr at that time. Like if one says Ameen when the Imam finishes Al-Fatiha. So if the Imam is reciting and the follower, for one reason or another, starts reciting late, so he is not in sync with the Imam. The Imam finishes and is about to say Ameen while the follower is still at Maliki Yawmiddin. At this point, the follower can say Ameen with the Imam and then continue from where he left off. This does not consider interrupting the surah, of Al-Fatiha because it's recommended to say Amin with the Imam. So if someone came late and the Imam, for like another example, if someone came late and the Imam finished reciting Surah Al-Fatiha and is reciting Surah Al-Teen and finished reciting Surah Al-Teen, the reciter can say, Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahidin, because that is recommended to say it at the end of the surah. And so he can say that and then go back to finish the recitation of Al-Fatiha, and he doesn't have to go back to the beginning. Also, it's an obligation when reciting the Fatiha according to the way it is written, the way it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. So basically, to recite it in the same order. So for example, if someone says, إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين مالك يوم الدين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم, this is not valid because he did not observe the order. Also, one needs to take care of when reciting the Fatiha to pronounce the letters properly from their exits, observing the characteristics. So if someone says sirat or sirat instead of sirat, his recitation is invalid. And there are other examples like that. And many don't observe the recitation of the exit. The author said, and avoiding the error which bridges the meaning, such as saying an'amtu instead of an'amta. It is prohibited to commit an error which does not breach its meaning, but it does not invalidate the prayer. So the explanation. It is considered as a condition in the saying of Al-Fatiha to not make an error in the recitation that changes the meaning or annihilate the meaning. So if someone says صراط الذين أنعمت instead of أنعمت, such an error changes the meaning. أنعمت means I bestow, and أنعمت means you bestow. So this changes the meaning, and in this case, the recitation is invalid, except if this occurs like the slip of the tongue, and he repeats it properly, then the recitation is still valid. So there are words that change the meaning, and this causes the recitation to be invalid. If someone makes an error that does not change the meaning, he is sinful, but his recitation is still valid. For example, if someone says alhamdu instead of alhamdulillah, then one's prayer would not be invalidated. However, if one knows that this is wrong recitation, and yet he recites it on purpose, one's prayer would be invalidated because one was taking the performance of the prayer as an occasion to play, and in the intention of playing invalidates the intention of praying. Okay. If someone did not or have not gotten the recitation of Al-Fatiha checked by an actual teacher, please let me know. So if they mispronounces it unintentionally, and they know that they mispronounced it unintentionally, have to go back and repeat it. Now, I don't know if he has to repeat the whole thing, like the whole surah, or if it's just that word. But if you catch yourself slipping, definitely repeat it. The author also said, right, yeah, to bow until one's palm can reach one's knees, ruku'. So the explanation is the fifth integral is to bow in a way that if one wants to put his palm on his knees, he can do that. If he bows to that extent, this is considered a valid ruku'. It is not a condition for the validity of the ruku' to put the palm on the knees. The condition is for him to be able to put two palms on the knees if he wanted to. And of course, it is better to put them on the knees, but here we are talking about the validity of the prayer. Now, if someone has short hands or short palms or long hands or long palms, the valid ruku' is for him to bow in a way that his palms reach his knees if they were of normal length. So to bow the ruku' to be valid, so the bowing of ruku' to be valid, one needs to reach his knees with his palm without bending the knees a lot. Bending the knees a little does not affect this integral. It's okay. One has to be sure that he is bowing up until that limit for his ruku' to be valid. If he bows in a way that he doubts, do my palms reach my knees or not? This is not a valid ruku', and he needs to be sure that he has bowed until that limit. The author said, the sixth integral is to remain motionless in ruku' for the duration of saying subhanallah, and this is called tamatmina. The explanation is the bones has to be in a state of stillness for at least the duration of subhanallah. So for a moment, so what some people do, they go to ruku' without waiting at all and at this position, and they go back up, and this is not a valid ruku'. The seventh integral is to straighten up after ruku', and the eighth integral is to remain motionless in that position for the duration of saying subhanallah. So the explanation, after making the ruku', the seventh integral is to get back up to the same position that he had before making ruku'. And the eighth integral is to remain motionless for a moment in that position. Now saying Sami Allahu liman hamida is sunnah. When he starts going up, he starts with that statement and he reaches and when he reaches all the way up, he ends with that statement. And then he stays there and says Rabbana wa lakal hamd. And this is also sunnah. The author said to prostrate, perform sujood twice by putting all or part of one's uncovered forehead on one's praying ground while applying a slight pressure. With one's lower body, like the buttocks, higher than one's upper body, and putting part of one's knees, the inside of one's hand, the bottom of one's toes on the ground. A non-Shafi'i said, or scholar said, that the prayer is still valid even if the head was higher in sujood than the buttocks. The explanation. The ninth integral is to prostrate twice. The prostration has to be done by putting on the ground 7 different organs: the forehead, the 2 inner parts of the hands, the knees, some of the inner parts of the toes of the 2 feet. And this is important, the inner toes of the feet to be touching the ground. So example, if someone was making sujood and he put the tips of his toes on the ground, not the inner parts, the sujood is not valid. Or if one part of the inner hand was put on the ground and the other one was not put on the ground, in one of those, this also is invalid. If one of those 7 organs was not put on the ground, the sujood is invalid. Among the conditions of the validity of sujood is for the forehead to be uncovered, or at least one part of it that touches the praying ground. So among the conditions for the validity of sujood is for the top part of the body to be lower than the bottom part of the body when making sujood. If they were even, this sujood is invalid. Also, among the conditions of sujood is for one to let the weight of his head rest on the floor. So he does not lift his head from the ground, or he does not lift the weight of the head, if you want, from the floor. So how is that known? The weight of the head would rest on the floor in the way that if there was cotton on the ground and underneath the cotton was one's hand, the cotton would be pressed and the effect of the weight of the head would appear on one's hand. It would show on the cotton. So if one makes sujood, one needs to rest his head on the floor. It is not a condition for the hands and the knees and the toes to be uncovered. There is a condition for the forehead to be uncovered. Some scholars outside of the Shafi'i school said that the upper part of the body does not need to be lower than the bottom part of sujood. It's not a condition for the validity of sujood as long as what one is doing is called sujood. The author said to have tama'mina in sujood, and this is again to remain motionless for the duration of saying subhanallah. The explanation. The 10th integral is to not move in sujood for a moment for a duration of saying subhanallah. And this is for the both sujoods. The 11th and 12th integral is to sit between the two prostrations and have tama'mina. So the 11th is to sit between the two prostrations, and the 12th integral is to have tama'mina. Just so we're clear. So after performing the first prostration, one sits up and in a sitting position for a period of time. He stays there long enough to say subhanallah. Then he performs another prostration. Intentionally leaving out sitting between the two prostrations invalidates one prayer. The author said that the next integral. Okay, sorry, I just did that. Okay, so the author said to sit for saying the last tashahhud, the salam ala nabi, and the closing salam. So saying the last tashahhud, the salam ala nabi, and the closing salam is an integral of the prayer, which would be invalid if they were not done while standing. So also intentionally saying assalamu alaikum while standing invalidates the prayer. It is enough to sit, regardless of the way the one sits, as long as it is considered sitting. So the author said to say the last tashahhud, one version of which is التحيات المباركات الصلوات الطيبات لله سلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته سلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Okay. The explanation. The 14th integral is to say tashahhud, and there are several ways to say this. All of those different ways that the Prophet ﷺ told them to the companions is a valid saying to any, it's a valid saying, so any of them work. Among them is the narration which is mentioned above. This is the narration of Abdullah bin Abbas. I think I missed the one that actually is by Imam Shafi'i, but the above one is still valid. The one written above is still valid. I think this one, the one that's above, is Abu Hanifa. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed some notes. But anyways, that one is still a valid saying. I just didn't want to give you guys the wrong information. Okay. So there was a specific one that Imam Shafi'i picked. And what this does not mean that his is the only one that's valid. It means that this is the one that Shafi'i said he prefers. But if one says another one which is narrated by the Prophet ﷺ, then it's valid. So Abu Hanifa picked this one, narrated from Abdullah bin Mas'ud, which is التحيات لله والصلوات والطيبات السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته سلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Now when saying the Shahada, make sure that you don't say أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله, because that's not a valid Shahada. It's أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. And Maliki chooses another one, and it's okay because all of them are narrated from the Prophet ﷺ. Now, according to Imam Shafi'i, one second, please. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So Maliki chooses another one, and that's okay because all of them are narrated from the Prophet ﷺ. Now, according to Imam Shafi'i, the tashahhud is an obligation. After sujood, one can sit and then say salam, and he has to say a narrated tashahhud. Let's say salatu ala nabi, and then you can say the tashahhud. Okay. The author said to say salat ala nabi, and the minimum is Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. So the explanation, saying salat ala nabi is an integral in the prayer. The author said, what is narrated above is valid, but this does not mean that this is the only valid statement. Salat ala Muhammad would be sufficient. Likewise, salat ala nabi. However, saying salat ala Ahmad is insufficient. More is also valid, such as Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallayta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka hamidun majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka hamidun majid. But also, just saying Allahumma salli ala Muhammad is valid. The author said to say the closing salam. The minimum is Assalamu alaikum. The explanation is one must be careful in pronouncing the closing salam to say Assalamu alaikum and not just Salamu alaikum. He has to start by saying Assalam. One needs to say Assalamu alaikum in succession without a lengthy separation. And one needs to say it loud enough for himself to hear. He needs to be facing the Qibla with his chest because while saying Assalam, he is still in the prayer, and so he needs to keep facing the Qibla while saying it. The obligation is to say salam, to say the first salam, basically on your right. The second one is sunnah, and it's not an obligation to say wa rahmatullah, but it's better to do so. And the last integral, the author said, is to observe the order. Explanation. Among the integrals of the prayer is for one to perform the integrals in the order. So to stand if able and have the intention of prayer in one's heart and saying Allahu Akbar. To stand for the obligatory prayer if able, to recite the Fatiha, to bow in ruku', to have tama'mina in ruku'. Again, that means to be motionless for the duration of saying Subhanallah. To straighten up after ruku', to have tama'mina while standing. To prostrate, sujood twice. To have tama'mina in sujood. To sit in between the two prostrations. And to have tama'mina in sitting. To sit for the saying of the last tashahhud, the salat al nabi. Okay, and the closing salam. I think I wrote that twice. The 14th is to say the last tashahhud. To say the salat al nabi. Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. To say the closing salam. To absorb the order. So the one who intentionally leaves out absorbing the order by performing an integral of action ahead of his time, this invalidates his prayer. Likewise, if one says Assalamu alaikum before its due time, this one invalidates the prayer. Like before saying the tashahhud. Now, if he says an integral of saying before its due time, other than the closing salam, this does not invalidate his prayer. But he still has to say it in his place. For example, after reciting al-Fatiha, someone recites tashahhud. That is reciting in the last setting. In this case, his prayer is not invalidated, but he has to recite the tashahhud at its sitting place. Okay. Now, what if someone forgets performing one integral among the integrals of prayer? If this person did not move from his current integral to the next integral, then one performs this integral right now in his current position. So, for example, if someone says Allahu Akbar with the intention, and instead of reciting Al-Fatiha, one forgets to recite Al-Fatiha, so he starts reciting a surah after Al-Fatiha, but he is still standing in the position to recite Al-Fatiha. Before bowing, he remembers that he did not recite Al-Fatiha. In this case, he recites the Fatiha right there and then because he is still in the position in which the Fatiha is recited. Now, if the person moves to another position, there are two different cases. So the first case, if one leaves out an integral and then one remembers that he left his integral before getting to the same integral of the next rak'ah, he has to perform that integral. So example, if one recites al-Fatiha, then he forgets to make ruku', he goes down into sujood, and while he's in sujood, he remembers that he did not make ruku'. And this is also the case. So, or like he makes sujood, he sits and he makes the second sujood and then he remembers. Or he makes sujood, he sits, makes the second sujood, and he stands up to reciting the Fatiha, and then he remembers. So he remembers before getting to the same integral from the next rak'ah. In this case, before getting to ruku'. So what he does is he goes back immediately to performing the integral that he left out. So if he remembers while making sujood that he leaves the sujood, he stands up and he makes a sujood. If he's sitting between the two sujoods, then he remembers I didn't make ruku'. He stands up immediately and he makes ruku'. If he's reciting al-Fatiha and then he remembers he left out continuing or making so if he's reciting al-Fatiha and then he remembers that he left out ruku', he leaves out the Fatiha, he stops and he goes into ruku'. In this case, he just, So he goes back to the integral that he left out. If he is continuing from that same rak'ah, if he caught himself while he was in that same rak'ah. So if the person remembers that he skipped an integral before reaching the same integral of the next rak'ah, he just immediately goes back to that integral that he missed, performs it, and then he continues his prayer in the correct order from there. The second case is if one does not remember he left out an integral until completing the same integral from the same rak'ah. So if we take the example from above, the person does not remember that he left out ruku' and until he reaches ruku' from the second rak'ah. In this case, he considers himself that he's now continuing the previous rak'ah. So it will be as if he is continuing, he's on rak'ah 1. And all what he did after or from that integral that he left out until reaching the same integral from the next rak'ah is overlooked. It's as if he did not do it. Which means if someone is in the first rak'ah, he recites al-Fatiha, and instead of going ruku', he goes into sujood. He sits up, he makes sujood again, and he stands up, reads al-Fatiha, and then he makes ruku'. And while in ruku', he remembers that in the previous rak'ah, he did not make ruku'. In this case, he considers himself that he is now continuing the first rak'ah. The same. Okay, so in the previous example, he did not remember in ruku' that he left out ruku', but he remembered while he was in sujood of the second rak'ah. So yeah, the same judgment applies. So the same judgment is here as if he remembered the ruku' in the third rak'ah. So he forgets that he performed the ruku' in the first rak'ah, right? And he does the second one, and he's currently on the third one, and then he remembers that, oh, I didn't do ruku' in my first rak'ah. In this case, he considers himself that he is currently in the second rak'ah and is currently continuing from there. So he continues to do the remaining parts of the prayer. Is this clear? If this does not make any sense, please let me know. Okay, alhamdulillah. Okay. So the judgment that we mentioned above only applies to the one who is not following the imam in prayer. As for the follower, he does not leave out following the imam. Rather, he performs a rak'ah after the imam finishes the prayer. An example is that if the imam is praying and the follower is praying behind him, the imam recites al-Fatiha. The imam goes into ruku' and the follower does not go to ruku' because he is thinking about something else and he's not paying attention. And so then the imam went back up and he is now standing and the follower is standing, and then the imam goes to sujood, and the follower, because he was thinking about something else, he goes to sujood. Again, the follower does not leave out intentionally, leaving out the rak'ah. He did it because he was not paying attention. Now when he gets to sujood, he remembers, I did not make ruku'. So what does he do then? He does not leave out following the imam. He keeps following the imam, and when the imam says the closing salam, he performs ruku'. And now there's another case. If the imam forgets ruku' and he goes down immediately to sujood, is it haram for the follower to follow him in that? It is haram for the follower to follow him in that. So if he does that, he invalidates the prayer. So what does the one around him do? They say Subhanallah out loud to remind him to make ruku'. And the imam would then stand up and make up what he missed, and the follower then follows him. But he does not go immediately to sujood with the imam. If the follower does that, he invalidates his prayer. This is because he's intentionally leaving out one integral and missing the observing order. Now, if the follower tells the imam, Subhanallah, and the imam does not go back because the imam is sure he did not leave out an integral, and the follower is sure that the imam did leave out the ruku', in this case, the follower makes his intention to separate from the imam. Now, if someone does not remember which rak'ah is in and doubts, am I in the third or fourth? He goes by the least, so he considers himself in the third rak'ah, and he continues based on that. Now, it is sunnah, before saying the salam, the ending of the prayer, to make two sujood, if one forgets. And this is an obligation, but not sunnah. I think it's called sujood al-sahw. Yeah. If the follower doubts about the number of rak'at, and he's praying behind the imam, he cannot rely on the imam in this case. He needs to rely on his own conviction. So if he doubts, is this the third or the fourth? And then he notices that imam sits to recite the shahud. In this case, he does not say, oh, okay, it's the fourth. If he is still doubting, he considers that this is his third for himself, and then he needs to perform one more rak'ah. The one who performs wudu, and after finishing wudu, he doubts after, did I leave out washing my face or did I wash my hand? So he has doubt. In this case, it doesn't matter because he is doubting after finishing the purification, and doubting after finishing does not affect the judgment. So I have some questions at the end of the class. Okay. If someone cannot say something or some letter in the Quran properly, does this invalidate the recitation of the prayer? So if he has an illness in his tongue or in his mouth that prevents him from pronouncing the letter properly, then he does not recite any verse that contains that letter. Rather, he recites something else instead of this verse. He does not recite the verses of Al-Fatiha, he recites another verse from the Quran in its place. If he is not able to do that, then he makes dhikr in its place in a way that the numbers of letters of that dhikr would not be less than the numbers of letters of that verse. If he cannot do that, then he remains silent for a period of time needed to recite that verse. If someone makes sujood, puts his forehead, so he covers the integral for sujood, then he lifts his toe. This does not invalidate the sujood. I don't know if we will talk about this, but I'll talk about this right now. If someone puts his forehead and then he puts it on a rock, for example. And then he lifts his head up to remove that rock and he puts his head back down. This invalidates his prayer because he put two sujuds, and that invalidates the prayer. Okay, when the Imam says Assalamu alaikum, he can have it to be for those who are behind him, the jinn who are praying behind him, the angels, also the followers. The follower, when he says it, he makes the intention to replying the Imam. If someone was wearing hard boots and he cannot bend the inner part of his toes because it's hard, he has to take off his shoes before praying, else it's invalid. If someone is in sujood and is making dua, but the dua is not in Arabic, it's in English, does this invalidate the salah? The teacher said, I'll recheck this case, but what I would tell you to do is to make the dua in your heart if you do not know the Arabic. And now, if the dua is in Arabic, is the dua specific with a hadith, or is it any dua? The teacher said you can make the dua in Arabic. It's sunnah and rewardable. So any dua in Arabic. If someone is in the middle of Al-Fatiha and then he sneezes and he says Alhamdulillah, he needs to repeat it again. If a person bends their knees and while making ruku', does this invalidate the prayer? They have to be straight and their leg for ruku' to be valid. If they do not, then by consequence, their prayer is invalid. If the man stands intentionally when he was supposed to be sitting after finishing the fourth rak'ah, let's say, this invalidates the prayer because he is adding an extra integral. While in sujood, the person's entire arm from the fingers to the elbows is resting on the floor. What is the judgment? It's permissible, but it's disliked. What if the imam sneezes and says Alhamdulillah and the follower says Yarhamukallah? This invalidates the prayer of the follower because he is addressing the imam with that. Yarhamukallah means may Allah have mercy on you. So he's talking to him, and talking invalidates the prayer. If he says Allahumma yarhamuk, which means may Allah have mercy on him, or Allah yarhamuhu, that's what it means. You can't say Allah yarhamak because that's again talking to him. So this is a correction. If he says Allahumma yarhamu, which means may Allah have mercy on him, then this does not invalidate the prayer because then it would be a dua without talking with another person. So he needs to recite the Fatiha from the beginning if he does that. If the woman is praying and during the prayer her hair accidentally slipped, is the prayer valid? If one strand of her hair is exposed, it depends. Did this happen because of her action or not? If it happened because of her action, her movements, then her prayer is invalid. If it happens because of something else, like the wind, she covers it immediately, and then her prayer is not invalidated. It is disliked to talk while making wudu. Making dhikr is better. If someone uses a lot of water to make wudu, this is disliked. Now, we were talking about the water that is used to wash the hands, face, and feet. We're not talking about leaving the faucet open because it can be open for other purposes, maybe to clean the pipes. So this does not annihilate the reward of the prayer. So does this annihilate the word of the prayer? The answer is no, but the reward decreases. This is also the water that is used other than the masjid water. If it is the water of the masjid, it is haram because it is haram to use more than what one needs.